Okay, so I'm aware of the time. We've just gone 1:30. So shall I make a start? Because I'm not the best with timing, so I'll probably go over a little bit. Give me a bit of a nudge if I do. So the training today, it seemed quite broad to begin with. So I was given kind of like, well, I'd agreed to social skills. And then when I kind of started looking into that, I thought, covers such a broad area. Like, where should I begin? What should I focus on? Given, you know, like 45 minutes. So I thought I'd look at kind of the diagnostic label social communication disorder, look at like diagnostic criteria for that, and then discuss some assessment and intervention practices for us. Now it's not letting me go across now. Does anyone know how to do this? So I'm just trying to move across on the PowerPoint.
You should just be able to press it. There
Yeah,
you go.
blocking it. I don't know if I was clicked on something else. And then finally, I thought at the end, I'd talk a little bit about the social communication intervention programme, the SCIP. I know we had Kathy Adams and Jack Gale come in a few years ago, and they gave us a talk about the programme and the intervention. And we were going to be involved in, we were hoping to be involved in some work with them, which potentially could still be an option moving forward. I'll discuss that towards the end. So I thought I'd start by just summarising what social communication is, what it means. So basically, it's the use of non-verbal and verbal language across different social contexts, and basically how we use language to communicate within different social interactions. So there are four main components that come under social communication. So the first is social cognition, and that's all those cognitive processes that we use when we interact with people. So that relates to theory of mind, inferencing, joint attention, emotional competence and emotional regulation. We've got that within the context of then social interaction, which basically is just the different activities and situations where we might interact with different people. And then you kind of combine that with pragmatic skills, which is all of those unwritten rules of conversation, being able to judge the situation and match your style of language according to the situation and the people that you're speaking to. And then we've got language processing as well. So that can be written or spoken. And it's how we process and use language in those different situations. So I don't know, I was going to ask, what do you guys tend to use in terms of labels if you come across children with social communication difficulties or where social skills difficulties? Do you have certain labels or diagnostic terms that you use?
Just social communication. I used to use semantic pragmatic, but I think that's been replaced with social communication.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, just social communication. I don't narrow it down. I don't know what other people do.
I've never used social communication disorder. It's not because I'm aware of it, but I don't feel like I know fully what the differential diagnosis is to then use that as a better description than purely stating more than what I see, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that's where some of the confusion, it's a bit like developmental language disorder versus just kind of generically saying language disorder or language impairment. It's making that, I suppose, that defining statement of saying this is what they have. And I think in the past, these terms have been used interchangeably, haven't they? I tend to look at social communication difficulties. If I don't want to give the diagnosis of a social communication disorder, I'll describe the social communication difficulties, and that's the characteristics and the needs that we're seeing the children present with, rather than giving them the actual specific label. So social communication difficulties, we can see that co-occur with so many different disorders and conditions. It might not be caused by the primary condition that a child has. So I've got a child with ADHD that I'm seeing in school at the moment, but she has major social communication difficulties as well. And also queried autism, but she's going through the process. It's not been picked up kind of before, but there are these indications there. But because obviously we know that females tend to kind of present differently to males, they might not access the services or get picked up until a bit later on. So there's this gap, isn't there, in kind of recognising what those needs are and being able to label them appropriately. So we've got social communication difficulties that can co-occur, and they're often a defining feature of other conditions like ASD. So children with ASD, as part of their core need, they have social communication difficulties. Whereas then if you look at social pragmatic communication disorder, I've narrowed it down. I think I've called it like SCD or SPCD. I've seen it more recently in the literature called SPCD to include the pragmatic element. But basically that is a distinct diagnosis that's in the DSM-5. Like you said, Liz, it replaces the semantic pragmatic language disorder or pragmatic language impairment. And the reason that they changed it was because it's not just pragmatic skills that are affected, there's language processing, there's social understanding and social interaction needs. So the reason that they were given this new label is to encompass all of those different facets to the difficulty and the disorder. So one thing that I wanted to say, so obviously it replaces the previous terms. I found this quite confusing when I came to look at diagnostic labels and criteria. So according to the DSM-5, social communication disorder, or SCD as I'm going to call it, can co-occur with other language difficulties and language disorders, but it can't co-occur with other diagnostic labels. So children with ASD can't then also have a diagnosis of SCD. What they would have is social communication difficulties, not a social communication disorder. Does that make sense? They can't have the two diagnostic labels at the same time. If they've got ASD, they can't have SCD. And it's the same with other mental and intellectual disorders as well.
Can I ask, when, like, we've all made referrals to CAMS for an assessment of their social communication difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I've ever had them come back and say it's a social communication disorder. They've either said, yeah, autism, no, not autism, but they do have social communication difficulties. I'm like, so I'm kind of, I think, am I wrongly referring some of them that maybe are social communication disorder, or CAMS maybe not using it? I don't know as much.
I think it's so hard to like unpick it all, isn't it? So I kind of think, yeah, there's these children that might not have, so the defining feature of SCD is that they don't have the repetitive and restrictive behaviours and interests that's seen in children with autism. So that's kind of like the distinguishing feature, really.
Right.
But then we do have children who, it's not as clear cut, is it? And they don't fall into these neat boundaries. Some children do have repetitive and restrictive behaviours. They might have obsessive interests, but the severity of that difficulty or how much it's impacting means that if it's not as severe, they might not be given that ASD diagnosis.
Mm.
But then if they do have these features, they don't fall neatly into an SCD diagnosis. So they're kind of straddling somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And it's like, which service do they access? Which pathway do they access? But I think with or without social communication disorder diagnosis, I think we've said this before with DLD, I'd prefer to work on the need and the characteristics that I see rather than the diagnosis. Mm. So a lot of the interventions are appropriate for a child with social communication difficulties or disorder because there's an overlap in the features so much.
Thank you.
It's okay. So I know everyone's probably seen this already. It's the DSM-5 criteria for SCD. So the main defining feature is that there's a disproportionate difficulty with pragmatic and social skills above and beyond any difficulties that children have with structural aspects of grammar and language. So it's kind of said that children with SCD won't have the typical features of DLD in terms of poor word structure and poor grammar, but there will be an impact on language further up, kind of above sentence level is what we see. So higher level language skills, inferencing, all of those kinds of difficulties. We tend to see symptoms begin in the early developmental period, so kind of under the age of 5. But a lot of the time, these difficulties don't manifest until later on, when the demands of the social situation start to outweigh the child's capabilities. And that's when we see this mismatch. So there is an overlap with kind of features of DLD early on. And then we start to see the social communication side, kind of those impairments become more noticeable and more marked as the demands become greater. And as I said, the symptoms, we can't attribute them to other medical or neurological conditions like autism. So I was trying to put together like a visual that would kind of show the continuum and the different overlapping features between different diagnostic labels that we have. And the reason that I've put ASD on one side and social communication disorder on the other is because we can't have these two labels together. We can't have these two diagnostic labels for one child. But we know that there's an overlap in terms of the social communication needs of these two groups. But interestingly, we then can have a subset of children with ASD who have language disorder. I don't know if anyone's seen, it tends to be called language disorder associated with ASD. So there's an overlap in terms of ASD and language disorder. We then have obviously children with developmental language disorder. And then this is where I got a little bit confused reading the literature, because we then have a subset of children who have developmental language disorder, but they can have co-occurring social communication disorder. So there was a recent study that looked at, it was a population-based study, and they said up to 30% of children with a history of DLD then meet the criteria for social communication disorder as well. But then we have quite a large subset of children who have social communication disorder without any history of DLD. So we know that DLD isn't the cause of social communication disorder, if that makes sense.
Can I ask a question, Belle?
Yeah.
Thinking of sensory processing and ADHD, can it co-occur with those, or is it associated with?
I think, so apparently it can't co-occur with ADHD.
Right.
That's like a different like medical or neurological condition. I don't know in terms of sensory processing, but there's such an overlap, isn't there? Would that then be classed more as ASD? Is that with or without repetitive and restrictive behaviours, I'd guess?
It's hard, isn't it? Because sensory processing, for example, because of the anxiety associated with it, and ADHD as well, leads to rigid and inflexibility and repetitive behaviour.
Yeah.
So it's just really complex. So not ADHD, but possibly SPD. Maybe I could look into that one.
Yeah. I think there's still not an agreement really on in terms of like where people tend to draw the lines and the boundaries. So I think there's still a lot of work being done to unpick the different diagnostic labels and the overlapping features.
Yeah, it's complex.
It is complex. It's not easy. I don't think I've never, like Sophie was saying, I've never diagnosed anyone with SCD. I just kind of describe the social communication difficulties that I see, because I don't feel confident in being able to do that either. So this is kind of just a summary of what I've just discussed in terms of the differential diagnosis and how we might start to unpick a little bit more the children that we're seeing. One thing I did look at, I don't know if it's, might not be on this slide, was I can't remember what study it was that I read, but basically they said there's no current gold standard assessment that can help us distinguish or effectively diagnose social communication disorder. But I read that one of the best measures that we have is the CCC2 by Dorothy Bishop, because that taps into all of the different DSM-5 criteria. And even though it's not seen as a definitive like diagnostic tool, you can use the index points to kind of help guide your decision making in terms of, does this child have DLD? Does this child have SCD or ASD features? And it all comes down to the difference between the general communication composite score and the social interaction deviance, like that composite score as well. So I think I've got it written down, and I can kind of send it in a separate document if anyone would find it useful. But apparently if it's a GCC of below 55 indicates language impairment, but if the child scores above 9 on the SIDC, which is the social interaction deviance composite, then the classed as having DLD, or it's indicative that they've got DLD. Whereas if they score 8 or below, then that's indicative of social communication disorder. I don't know if anyone's seen that already.
No, can you send that out to us?
Yeah. It was in, I think it was a study from 2020 that I read. But then obviously we've got if there's a negative score on the social interaction deviance composite, then that indicates ASD. But I don't know where the cutoff or the boundary is where it stops being SCD and becomes ASD, or if there's an overlap there as well, and then we have to go back and look at other features associated with ASD as well. Again, it's not clear cut, is it? It's very blurry in terms of boundaries. So just looking at kind of recent studies, what's been done, I've made a list of kind of what is considered gold standard or best practice for assessing social communication difficulties in children. So it's always important to do a norm referenced language assessment, because even though these difficulties are more subtle, children with SCD do tend to have impaired language, might always not be picked up on standardized language assessments. And it could be higher level language difficulties that the children present with, but it's always worth doing it. So we've got that baseline score and we know we can kind of compare, actually, is this more DLD with social communication difficulties, or is it more of an SCD kind of child that we're seeing? We then look at parent-teacher reports and where we can obviously working with the children to get their views and reports from them. I've mentioned the CCC2 as being one of the best ones that we have, and that's what I tend to use. That's what I give out to parents and to staff. I've never used the social communication questionnaire. I don't know if anybody else has used that. It's one that tends to feature in the literature quite a bit, but it seems, I think it's got 40 or 50 questions, so it's similar to the CCC2. I don't know if it taps into other skills or other needs as well, but
do we have access to one of those, Val? I've not actually seen.
I'm not sure. I've not seen one, and I googled it, and
I've not seen one.
You kind of have to buy it, but yeah, I've never. It's used in the literature quite a bit, but sometimes it's used alongside the CCC2. So I kind of feel like, do you need both, or would
a
one?
Bit of overkill?
Yeah. But a lot of, I don't know if everyone else kind of agrees, a lot of our assessment that we do for social communication skills tends to be informal, observational, because it's got to be functional. It's got to be in the child's environment. Bringing them out and doing an assessment on a one-to-one, we're not getting to see those social skills across different contexts with different people. And that's what we need to be seeing to look at where the breakdowns are occurring. In the literature, it also says about gaining a conversation sample. This is something, I've not ever done this. I've never taken a formal sample of a conversation. I just make notes informally as I'm having a conversation with a child or watching them interact with the peers or with staff. And then narrative sample, I tend to use the ACE, but I know obviously there's other methods that we could do, not looking at story recall as much, but story generation instead, because that taps into a different kind of skill. Maybe asking the child to tell a familiar story or fairy tales that we know they're quite familiar with, but it's not where they've been given that model already immediately before to repeat. Does anyone else use other assessment tools or things that aren't listed on here?
I use an informal one that I got from Teachers Pay Teachers, which does sort of like the narrative and inferencing. Mm-hmm. But they also added a double interview on the end where you ask them questions and then they've got to interview you back, and you sort of take notes on what questions do they ask you. So some of them just literally copied the questions that I'd them, rather than generate their own. So that's the only other thing that I do that's not on here, is the double interview. Yeah.
And I've used the on the talk about resources, these talk about social skills and talk about friendships. There's a questionnaire at the front, which I've used with teachers and I think occasionally with parents, and it maps out the child's skills in a circular diagram and where it highlights where the needs are. It's very brief, but it kind of gives you a starting point of where you might want to begin intervention and develop strategies and things.
It's a nice visual as well, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think when you've got so much, because obviously to tap into all those different social communication facets, we need to be drawing on information from multiple different sources. And then it's what to do with all that information. It can be a little bit overwhelming sometimes, I find, when I don't have standardized scores and percentiles and I've just got lots of more qualitative data. I'm like, okay, how do I make sense of this and how do I start setting targets with all this information that I've got? And it can be a little bit overwhelming.
What was that one on? Is that the talk about? Did you say
about social skills and talk about? I've got it here. I'll show you that quick if you want.
Yeah. The other thing I sometimes do is I'll do a sentence completion task. I feel happy when, I feel sad when, I feel angry when, and that's always quite insightful to see what they come up with.
So this is it rates. Sorry, I can't see a feedback on my screen of
Yeah, we can see it. We can see it.
Okay.
Cool.
So there's like a questionnaire and it grades it in terms of like 1 to 3. So kind of how is this child with this skill? So this is friendship one. So there's self-esteem, body language. So one of the questions is able to use appropriate body language with peers. And one is like obviously like really sad face, and 4 is like a happy face, like yes, they've got this skill or no, they haven't. Based on those scores, you then shade in the diagram. It kind of covers the different areas of like self-esteem, body language, awareness, conversation kind of things. And then depending on where they're scoring 1 or 4s, that's where you'd know like where the level of need is. So it kind of summarizes all of the skills in like one neat diagram, which I think is quite nice. So like you said, Tara, it's a nice visual to have.
I think I've completely forgotten about that. I remember seeing that years ago, but not really so recent. Is that on the drive?
I'm not sure if we have this on the drive. I think there's maybe parts of the resource, but I don't know if the entire thing is.
There's something talk about. I'll have a look and see if I can find it.
If not, is this one that we are able to reproduce and scan? Because I'm happy to scan that in or make copies and leave them in the office. I think you can make copies. So
Might be copies of certain bits of it, maybe.
Yeah. So that's the only kind of other tool that I use at the minute.
Have you got a disc with yours, Belle? I've only got the talk about the teenagers on me at the minute, but I've got a disc CD-ROM thing.
I think the teenagers one's on the drive. There is one on the drive where you like click through, it's all interactive, which I think is, must be like a CD.
Right.
No, I don't have a CD with mine.
I think, Belle, I don't know, for one of the books that I've got, there's a code on it and you register online and then you can get access to all the resources.
Oh, right, okay, I might do that then.
I'm wondering whether that does the same.
Oh, you're right, Liz. It says to access the resources, please visit this website and use this code. So I'll do that.
Yeah. And then you can download them then.
Right. I'll tell you what, is it worth me just kind of taking a picture of this, and if people want to access what
No, because they ask you a question. They ask you to find a page and put in a certain word.
Oh, to prove that you've got the physical resource. Okay.
Yeah, and it's different every time.
Right. Okay. Well, what I'll do then is I'll access what I can and then save it to the drive if I can do that.
Yeah, give it a go.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll kind of see what happens from there. So you can tell I'm not very technical. I'm like paper based and so yeah, they're the kind of like assessment outlines. There we go. I also found these. So these assessments, standardized assessments, were referred to in the literature quite a bit. So there's the test of pragmatic language. Obviously, you can access this if you wanted in your own time. I've added the link so it'll take you straight to the resource. But I think one's American, one's Australian. So obviously, it's going to be like some cultural differences in terms of what children kind of their responses and the types of questions that are asked. But they all tend to be a series of like between 4 and 6 subtests that tap into kind of that theory of mind, understanding the perspectives of others and being able to problem solve and discuss breakdown in communication. One of the assessments, I think it's the clinical assessment of Pragmatics, uses video-based scenarios, and they get the children to discuss like the breakdowns in the conversation and get them to reflect a little bit more, which I thought was quite a nice one because it tapped into that meta-pragmatic awareness and that monitoring.
Yeah, Claire uses something on YouTube that I was observing her use. I wonder if that was something. It was a video and it pauses and asks for certain questions. Yeah. Alina, do you know what it is? Have you seen Claire use it?
No, I haven't heard of that. Not sure.
No. I'll have to ask Claire. I don't know what it was she was using, but it was on, I'm sure it was on YouTube, so we could probably get access to it.
Yeah, that'd be quite good to see, because I think these are standardized assessments, they give you standard scores and age equivalents. I did find something that I thought was quite useful, and I've created a folder with all of the papers that I've read and some additional information. It was social communication benchmarks. So for kind of each age bracket, what kind of social communication skills we'd expect children to have in place for that age. And it's in terms of like meta-pragmatic awareness, which develops after like 7 years. So it kind of helps, like when it's appropriate to target certain skills, because if they shouldn't have that skill by that age anyway, then it's not really appropriate to be working on it. So I've got that document. I'll share the folder with everyone once we've done the training today. Hopefully it'll be useful. So just wanted to kind of discuss, I mean, this is very generic kind of intervention approaches for social communication difficulties, but this ties in with obviously a lot of the interventions that we do for any kind of impairment really. So we've got the impairment-based approach, which works on those specific skills, teaching kind of skills and strategies on kind of whatever it is that you find from your assessment that the child needs. But a lot of what the literature is saying at the moment is that we need to be involving peers as much as possible. And this made me think of what you were talking about, Liz, in your Calm to Communicate training, about involving peers, just to develop that awareness of neurodiversity and just kind of developing that conversation, allowing that conversation to happen, and discussing that there are so many differences, and it's celebrating the strengths and the differences that we all have, and kind of not expecting everyone to fall into this neurotypical kind of pattern of teaching children that way.
It's increasing the tolerance of the neuromajority for the neurodiversity. Because interesting enough, Mariam and I have had an email of saying, can you change the dynamics of a group because one of the children is really impatient with another one that takes a long time to answer.
Yeah, so it's like that's not enabling that kind of understanding and building that tolerance, is it? Whereas what we want to be doing is discussing like the complete continuum of skills and differences that people have. So I was thinking in terms of when you were doing, I know I caught it at a later date, but when I watched the Calm to Communicate and we were talking about what kind of work can we do to kind of celebrate these differences and discuss neurodiverse kind of perspectives a bit more, and not try and push children into our expected kind of norms. And I was thinking, for children where they talk obsessively about like one particular interest, and you see other children who are just not interested at all, like, but obviously a lot of children with social communication difficulties can't pick up on those nonverbal cues that, well, the other children aren't really interested in this, and they'll still kind of be really keen to talk and not take a break. And it's where we can talk about, everyone's got interests that they have, and some people really like to talk about those things. It's recognizing to the point that it's becoming kind of an issue, and that getting children to recognize, I suppose it's getting the neurodiverse children to recognize that, okay, this is having an impact in this way, this is how my friends are responding, maybe I need to monitor that a bit more, and I can talk about it for a little bit, and then I can ask them a question about something. But it's also getting the neurotypical children to then think, this child, my friend, they really like talking about that, and that's okay. I can give them a little bit of time to say what they want to say, and I can ask questions and show my interest. And then when it's time to talk about something I want to, I can. It's just having those conversations, isn't it? And developing that. And that's where, so in terms of, we've got like the one-to-one sessions that we do to teach different skills, prepare that child in really safe, structured environments with us. And when they're ready, then start kind of expanding that to some peer group interactions where they can role play, practice the skills that they've learnt with us. But that's where we get that chance to have that neurodiverse kind of conversation and celebrate those differences and raise awareness. All within the context of then kind of making the modifications for the environment, not reducing, but maybe adapting expectations that the staff have as well in terms of what they want that child to do.
That sounds amazing. And is this your model that you've created here?
It's what I read it in the literature and then kind of made my own model, I guess. Like the 3 points that I picked up on. So I just kind of thought it was a way of bringing all 3 facets together and kind of thinking about the different strands.
Yeah, I love it.
Thanks. So when I was trying to like think about outlining the different interventions that we have for social communication difficulties, the list goes on and on, doesn't it? There's like so many. So I thought I'd just outline a few that we tend to all kind of know and use. Score skill strategy, I've never really heard of, I've never used it, but I think it came up on like the ASHA website, and then it was referred to somewhere else as well. So I thought, well, I'm just going to put it there, and then I'm going to do a bit of background reading just to find out more about it. But I know that we all tend to use like comic strip conversations, social stories, social scripts, I've never used the SULP, the social use of language program, but I've heard other therapists in the team talk about it. Don't know if anyone here's used it.
I used it a million years ago, but
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you if it's still even in any kind of format now.
Right. What do people tend to use? Like, what do you guys tend to use for intervention approaches? I know I tend to pick a little bit of here and there and just a bit of a mismatch of different things, really.
Claire got me using power cards, which I found were quite good. Otherwise, comic strip conversations and social stories mainly.
Yeah.
I think moving back to your lovely intervention boxes you just had before, it'd be good to look at what interventions we use in each one, because I'm thinking in my head already, what do I use with my children individually? What do I use them when I'm applying it in a group? What do I, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I use a few more of the sort of like the pragmatic, you know, worksheets and things to talk about inferencing, all that sort of thing in a one-to-one. I wouldn't necessarily, I sometimes incorporate them in a group, but I wouldn't necessarily use them in a group. I'd move towards the sort of like the talk about or comic strip conversations or things like that.
Yeah, I was going to say I tend to do that, Tara. So I'll use like the black sheep press, like practical pragmatics, emotions kind of packs on a one-to-one. And then I do tend to use, because I think the talk about resources tend to have more group activities anyway. They just lend themselves to being more group friendly, I think.
They're fantastic to leave as well, aren't they? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, just to hand over. Yeah.
For some of mine that have been harder to engage, like there's little short films on YouTube, and we've used some of those, like getting them to think about like what might happen, and the different interactions, and then from that a comic strip, when they're particularly those children that maybe don't see the behaviours in themselves or around them, but actually in a cartoon or something that doesn't really represent humans in the same way, they'd be much more open to that. But it's interesting, I tend to work in a group actually when I'm doing social communication type stuff. I guess that's maybe just the needs of the children and the school or demands or whatever. So it's actually interesting that I don't do very much one-to-one on it really.
Sorry, I'm eating my lunch at the same time.
Hi, Joe.
Hi. I turned myself off. I thought nobody wants to see you eating. I used a thing called skill streaming. It's I don't know what age it's for, but the premise is you practice, and then you go out and you use those skills outside of a clinical setting type of thing.
Yeah,
quite structured. I think it's got a lot of good feedback and good outcomes.
Okay, was it called skills streaming?
Skills streaming.
Okay, I'll have a look at that. I've not heard of that. And Liz, I know in the past you've mentioned the conversation train that you use as well.
Yeah, that's a formal intervention, and they've now put it online as well. So I have saved because it's originally a book, but during lockdown they put it all online and we're offering it for free. So I did download it, and I think it's on the drive, but I think I couldn't find it. Couldn't Marion when I was trying to send it to you, and then I did find it, but where was that? I'll have to re-find it and maybe put it in whatever folder you've maybe got for social skills and put it in there. But yeah, that's been really good, and I've seen the kids transfer that into the classroom as well, because we just use the terminology, like one of them's derailing the conversation and going off track. And I'd just say, the child would start talking off topic and I'd say, oh, have you just derailed the conversation? And he'd go, oh yeah, and bring it back. It never stopped him doing it, but we were able to pick up on it when it happened faster, and the teachers were using the same terminology as well.
Yeah, were the visuals to go alongside like the terminology, Liz? Yeah,
so each carriage represents a skill, so you just keep adding the carriage on. So yeah, there's different visuals, and you keep this conversation going by adding the different carriages on. So I can't remember what they all are off the top of my head, but
I think I'd seen one that probably relates to the derailing the conversation, where it's a train, like a train track, and then with obviously a diversion, and like the train's going on the diversion instead of kind of staying on course.
Yeah, but it talks about, it uses the split track to how you can appropriately shift the topic, because obviously we don't just stay on one topic, we do shift, and it teaches the skill of how you can appropriately change topics.
Yeah, and signal that topic shift rather than just
Yeah.
abrupt kind of changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. So what I wanted to spend the next kind of 10-15 minutes talking about, yeah, I think we're okay time-wise, 10 minutes, I'll make it, is the social communication intervention program. I know kind of we've talked about this in the past, and I think some people are probably more familiar with the resource than others. So basically, I have a physical copy of the resource, which is quite overwhelming to kind of go through and to look at. It's very intense. I'm just going to recap very quickly on what the SCIP was. So the Social Communication Intervention Programme was designed between 2009, 2012. The research paper for the randomised control trial came out in 2012, the first one. And it's basically a randomised control trial looking at a new way of delivering therapy for social communication difficulties. And it's basically a manual of intervention activities that are targeted for each specific child. So even though children were all randomised to receive intervention, they didn't receive the exact same intervention. They all had it targeted and individualised according to their needs. So there were 85 children school-aged with previously termed pragmatic language impairment, what we now know to be social communication disorder. The treatment that they received was quite intensive. So it was with highly specialist speech therapists, research speech therapists, and trained speech therapy assistants who were research assistants at the university. I think they had 20 hours of input, or 20 sessions of input over one term, but the sessions were up to an hour long each. So it was very intensive, kind of highly specialist intervention that was delivered. Children in the control group, they received their treatment as usual from their local therapist, and they found that that could vary, just like we said, we use so many different resources, activities, programs. So they just kind of received what was already ongoing for them as their intervention. The outcomes of the randomised control trial, they were favourable in terms of recognising that SCIP made a difference compared to treatment as usual, but it wasn't picked up on any of the standardised language measures. So they used the CEL-4 for pre and post assessment, but what they found was that the CEL-4, because it doesn't tap into a lot of those higher level language skills necessarily, or it doesn't pick up on those subtle differences, children were tending to score within normal limits to begin with, so they didn't really make a noticeable change post intervention. Whereas the parent and teacher reported measures, they found that there were significant differences between the control group and the therapy group, so that there was a favour of SCIP, that parents and teachers were seeing this outcome provided by the SCIP intervention more than just receiving treatment as usual. So one of the things that the researchers kind of concluded was that we need a more sensitive measure to detect change in children where the difficulties might not be picked up by our standardised assessments that we have at the moment. And when children present with such varying needs like they do with social communication disorder, it's not a case of a one size fits all kind of approach. We need to really individualise it and tailor it to the child's needs. And that's what the SCIP does. So I'll talk you through the actual programme in a second. So I feel quite limited and constrained in terms of what I can show you, because there's big messages everywhere saying, do not reproduce this, do not electronically kind of do this. So I'm really sorry, because my plan was to scan loads in and give you lots of information, but I feel a little bit kind of bound in terms of what I can show you. But this is basically the SCIP intervention planning and record booklet, which takes you all the way from assessment to phase 3 of the intervention, which is generalisation and maintenance. So it takes you from start to finish, and it's the place where you can record all of the information that you need in terms of assessment, outcomes, performance, next steps. So basically, step 1 is the assessment. And there's kind of 4 sections on the record form where we'd record information that we've gathered from assessment. So in the manual itself, it recommends looking at all of these areas, so social communication, pragmatics, receptive and expressive language, and kind of any other language difficulties that you might pick up on that could be more indicative of developmental language disorder, like memory or kind of other difficulties too, like reading. Some of the assessments that they used in the skip, I've tried and I can't get a hold of them anywhere. So there's this topic, which is the targeted observation of pragmatics in children's conversation. And again, I think it's a series of photographs. I don't know if it's videos. And you ask children a series of questions and then score them up. And it's referred to quite a bit, but I've searched and can't find the actual assessment resource anywhere. And it's the same with this MIPO, the Manchester Inventory of Playground Observation, which looks at social interaction skills, breakdown in communication, and attempts to repair conflict. And again, I think I'm going to contact the researchers at the uni and just ask if these are available or where we can access them.
I do remember them being talked about at uni.
Yeah, I thought I'd had the topic somewhere. I've searched my old drive and I can't find it.
The topic really rings a bell, the MIPO less so, but we definitely, I don't know whether we've seen it or whether Kathy Adams, was just keen on talking about it, because it would have been around that time that she was obviously very hot on it.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like that would just help guide a little bit more of when we do our observations, just give it more kind of structure and standardise kind of what we're doing as a team. So I'm going to have a look at it. But the parent and teacher reports, the ones that they used for the skip, they provide in the back of the manual as the appendix, and you are able to photocopy it, so I can make some resources for the team. But it's got quite nice kind of specific questions to tap into different skills relating to interaction, friendships, social understanding. And they use those pre and post interventions. So I thought that could be something that we look at kind of developing and using as a team. Just kind of having a bank of assessment materials that we can all kind of tap into and use. So as well as kind of the, let's say, formal and informal assessment measures that we have, there's also other sections in the record form that kind of ask you to collect information from parents and carers and teachers on difficulties in social interactions. So giving you information about actual specific examples for that child of where they've had difficulties communicating, as well as things to do with hobbies and interests. I think you said, Sophie, something about collecting information of, can you give an example of things that make them feel happy, things that make them feel sad or angry, so that when we come in to look at especially phase 3, personalising things, we've got these real life functional examples that we can kind of plan around and refer back to. So it just helps really personalise everything. So then once you've got all your assessment information, you then start to look at mapping the assessment results to intervention phases and targets. The idea for phase 1 is it's a foundation phase, so that all children should access as many of the activities as possible. And this is in the record form. You can tick off the activities that are most appropriate. And kind of, it just creates a really nice record of what you've worked on. So there's 6 different sections in phase 1 that's all about comprehension monitoring, understanding social cues and social context, developing that metapragmatic awareness. So I think children were age 6+ that did the skip, and we should expect those metapragmatic skills to start developing around 7. So I think that was quite appropriate for a lot of the children. There was an element of narrative and storytelling, understanding emotions and friendships. So once children have worked on all of those skills, it's kind of to help make sure that children have got all those foundation skills that they need to ensure that they're ready for therapy for phase 2, which is the main part of the intervention. So phase 2 then looks at, there's 3 different components to intervention, and the idea is that you don't do all of the activities and that you don't do it kind of sequentially. You pick aspects from each area, because the idea is that all of these 3 areas, social understanding, pragmatics and language processing, they all contribute to social communication, so that we need to be targeting all 3 at once rather than kind of just work on social understanding, just work on pragmatics. It's favoured that you work on all 3, but you target the specific activities that the child needs. You don't kind of go through everything. So social interaction and social understanding, there's like 5 different aspects or 5 different domains to that component. And again, you target it depending on what you feel like the child needs and what comes out of that phase 1 assessment, the phase 1 interventions. When you've done that, phase 1 will then help inform your next targets of what you're going to work on. So I'm just going to show you very quickly, and I apologize because I wanted to have all this where I could just click on a screen and it would like be there. So for each kind of Susie, there's then like Susie 3 is developing and understanding flexibility, and within that there's like different tasks, and then each task and each activity is given on like a page or 2 where it explains the purpose of the task, the aim of that kind of subcomponent, I'd kind of say, where it's got all the materials that you'll need, step up, step down. So it's kind of got your session plans already written for you with all the activities that you should need. Like I said, there's over 150 activities that you can kind of tap into, but it's choosing the ones that are most relevant and meaningful for the child that you're working with. So we kind of got those going across pragmatics and language processing as well. You just tap into what you need.
You see that we look at this and we think this is like an amazingly useful resource if you've got unlimited time.
This
like,
is it. It's very intensive and very overwhelming to kind of know where to begin.
Yeah. Are they still doing like trials that we can put children forward into rather than us doing it? We're like,
well, this is one thing that I wanted to kind of discuss. So they did the original trial in 2012, and I know obviously they came to speak to us, is it like 2016, 2017? Because they were just getting the data together or starting the next phase, which was the feasibility study. That was published in 2020. I've added that to the folder. So basically, because they trialed SCIP in optimal conditions to begin with, highly specialist research therapists, you know, it's like up to 20 hours in one term, which, you know, realistically, we can't offer that to like individual children. It's just not practical. It won't fit in with a lot of service kind of requirements. So what they wanted to do was then look at, right, well, we know that SCIP works in optimal conditions. Does it work, you know, in everyday conditions with like therapists across the UK? So they trained 15 therapists in practice to deliver the SCIP. They had a different kind of outcome measure called goal attainment scaling. So basically they took 3 priorities from parents in terms of what they wanted their child to achieve, discussed that in terms of breakdown of a sequence of steps. So you want your child to be able to initiate more conversations with the friends, or not talk obsessively just about one interest, understand the impact when they say something hurtful to the friends, things like that. But then they talk about the series of steps that they do to get to that point. And then they'd score from the start to the end point based on, I think it was -1 to 5. So -1 was that it's got worse at this particular skill, or +5 was that it's considerably improved. And the idea is that we've got this standardized way of measuring whatever the individual target and outcome is. So you can kind of have different targets for different children, but we can standardize the way that they're all measured so that we can still collect all that data and make it more meaningful rather than having single case studies, and kind of put all that data together and have that standardized way of assessing it still. But what they found was feedback from the therapist was that it took a lot of training to kind of for them to get used to the therapy resources. They said it was really intensive. So I think they still did the 20 sessions, but therapists kind of fed back that it didn't work. It wasn't practical. They need to make a lot of adaptations in order for it to be able to fit into everyday practice. So I think that's where the next steps are going. I spoke to Kathy and Jack before Christmas and a couple of weeks ago, and they said they are looking at developing the next phase of the study. But I don't know what those plans are. They said they're in the early preliminary phases, but it could involve working more with therapists to kind of look at how they can make it even more accessible to use in practice. So I'm hoping like maybe that's something that we could be involved in. I think it would be quite nice for us to kind of have access to that like specialist training and pick out children that we see and kind of have a way of moving forward with it. One thing I wanted to look at in the meantime was maybe looking at setting up a working group between us, like a social communication kind of mini working group where we each kind of, if anyone in the team feels like I've got a child that I think might benefit from this intervention, or they've got social communication difficulties, we can kind of meet every so often. First, all like work together and kind of look at the assessment procedure, use the skip together to develop how we're assessing them and using that information. Then meet again to kind of discuss that phase 1, planning an intervention, go off and do that phase 1, come back and then plan for phase 2 together. And our targets are going to be slightly different for what we want for that specific child, but the way we plan and like work through the resources together could be quite nice. Because it feels very overwhelming to use this resource just on a one-to-one. And I feel like I know this resource quite well because I like proofread it, but in terms of like using it in practice, it scares me a bit because I look at it and I think, where do I begin? Like, I'd rather just pick up Black Sheep Press or something that's just easy to pick up and use. Whereas
Who's the target audience for with the book? Is it something that we can say in a school, oh, they need skip, can you go and buy the resource? Is it aimed at them?
It's aimed at speech and language therapists to deliver, not TAs at the moment. I don't know whether there's plans further on where we can do trade. I think at the minute, because of the nature and the intensity and the knowledge that's required, it's seen as a highly like a specialist intervention, the one that we would provide ourselves.
So being sort of like a bit stupid and a bit brain fogged, are we thinking this is specifically for our children who we've diagnosed with SCD, whereas we might use something like talk about for those children with characteristics, or children who are ASD or ADHD with social difficulty?
This has been applied to other children without a diagnosis of SCD. So I'm sure in the past they've used it with children with autism and social communication difficulties, because there's such an overlap in terms of need and characteristics. I'm sure I read in the feasibility study that they said this resource is appropriate for children with social communication difficulties, regardless of the diagnosis. But I think for the randomized control trial and to gain that evidence to begin with, they just wanted to kind of focus in on social communication disorder. But I think looking at this resource, like, it would help children with social communication difficulties in general. Like, there's so many different skills and things that you could tap into.
My lectures with Kathy about DLD, I think she spoke about this for DLD as well, didn't she?
Yeah,
like
the language processing. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think obviously at the moment it's kind of unpicking where to begin with it. And
yeah, because there's so many different sections from what I remember.
And I think it's, it's been trialled in like this ideal condition with these children who they've like managed to recruit who fit nicely into this kind of SCD box. Whereas I think what they're looking to do now is think, right, in practice and in reality, we've got children presenting with all different kinds of characteristics and overlapping features. Would this resource work just as well for them?
Yeah.
And I think we can it'd be interesting to see if we could start to work together with them and look at how we could use it within our team.
I do remember when we talked about it years ago, Belle, because I was struggling what to do with a particular child, and there was an activity, it had something to do with a football court.
Was it information requirements, like too much and too little?
Yeah, it might have been, or I can't quite remember, but the football bit comes back to me. And I can't even remember what the activity was, but I remember it thinking there are definitely gems in there that I was like, oh yeah, that's great. And I remember using it and thinking like it's useful, but I totally get that it just feels like an encyclopedia where you think, I don't even know where to begin. So even being able to just kind of have some more activities at our fingertips, thinking actually this child has made progress in this area, but we're still really struggling here, or actually it's more of this kind of difficulty. Knowing about like being able to navigate the tools would be a bit more useful, I think.
Yeah, and kind of tap into things a bit more. I've got a nice document that I think I got it when, I don't know, it was one that Kathy and Jack gave me, where basically they'd taken, the CCC2, each kind of question or each statement, and then they'd mapped it onto different activities within the skip. So basically, you know, like the one that says like item 33 on the CCC2, hurts or upsets others without meaning to. It then goes, work on Pragmatic 2.2.3, work on this, and it directs you to the specific activities. I thought
that would be really useful.
That would be quite nice of a way of mapping those assessment needs and the areas that are highlighted as in terms of priority. Thinking, right, well, these kind of activities would be suitable.
Because I find with the CCC2, I'm like, I don't really know. I do it, and then I get the score bit at the end that's on that GDoc that Imi and Joe did, and then I'm like, I don't understand. My scores aren't minus whatever or plus. So I'm like,
what do I do?
Like, great, that's cool. That's nice qualitative data, but I could have probably got that in a different way without all the scoring. So I don't know. That would be really useful.
Yeah, I'm the same as you, Sophie. I've done it and then gone, well, now what?
Yeah, no.
It's great for differential diagnosis, but that's about it, isn't it?
Yeah. And I hate to admit this in front of everybody, but I have to say social skills is one of those things where I don't have a set way of doing things. I feel like it's just different every time I do it. I gather the information differently. I don't have set groups, and I just feel like I lack a bit of direction with it, and something like that, having that info would be really useful. And perhaps I need to have a look what's inside the skip as well.
Yeah, I think it's really hard for me. Obviously, I would love to like just show you everything, and kind of, it's what's really nice is that it's got case studies that talks you through the assessment phase, the phase 1, and it's really detailed. So when I was like reading through it, and I thought, oh well, now I can see the rationale behind why they chose this activity over this one, and it helped kind of relate what you're doing to kind of having that case study. It's really helpful. But in terms of like moving forward, I think maybe it would be, I don't know if anyone would be interested in kind of, maybe the starting point would be to highlight some children or think of some children on your caseload or new referrals where you think, right, I've not started any intervention with them, or maybe you have done some initial, I'm not really sure, but they would benefit maybe from doing some of these skip activities. Like, should we have a starting point of, let's collect all that assessment information, whether we do it with new referrals versus children already on the caseload, I'm not sure. That's something we can decide.
Yeah, that'd be good. And I think the target structure that we've now got, I don't know if people are using it, but it follows sort of like the GAS, where the scores go up. We don't have the minus, but maybe we should say, like, if there are 3, what would count as progress? Is it 4? Is it?
Yeah.
And then we can measure that progress as a team, couldn't we?
Yeah. So even though each target is individualized for that child, the way that we're measuring it is the same, isn't it? So
yeah,
we can take that information. Yeah, I like that. So maybe that is something we can kind of plan. If anyone has any like children where they think, right, should we give it a go? Should we just start with the assessment and see where we go? Then I'd be happy to, I don't know, maybe once every couple of months or once a month. I don't know what everyone's timings kind of would allow, but where we just get together and just kind of have some joint discussions on, right, so we've done these assessments, I've done this one, what kind of things are we unpicking as like the priority, right, let's look at how we can then map that onto that phase 1 and like go from there. Kind of, the good thing is all of the activities, so I think it's page 165 all the way up to page 400, we can photocopy, so we can have like this whole portion of the manual like ready to go that people can just pick up and take with them. It's just all the theory and the examples and the planning that we're not allowed or not supposed to.
To be fair, that's not what we would be using from my point of view. It's just the stuff that you like that you can physically do. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think obviously there's still got to be that therapist flexibility and interpretation and you know, like our individual planning styles and knowledge. We're all going to do things a little bit differently, even though we've got this manual of activities, therapist expertise where we all do things a little bit differently, and that's got to be taken into consideration, hasn't it? So there's that kind of flexibility too. It was just like I've had this like on my shelf for the past like 6 years, and it's just gathering dust, and I thought I need to do something with it, like, and kind of share it with the team a bit more, because I've just kind of had it here. And I do think once we start unraveling and unpicking what's in here, I think it's going to be a really useful resource for us to use. And like we said, it doesn't have to be necessarily, because it is such an intensive resource and it requires a lot of our time, and we could just, like you said, Sophie, just pick out kind of, you know, like if you think, oh, well, do you know what, I've got the Pragmatic emotions pack and that is doing its job for what I need it to, but this child is like really struggling with picking up on social cues and this has got a whole section on that, or they're really struggling with comprehension monitoring, like how do you get the child to kind of reflect on, are they just guessing versus actually trying to work out the answer? And that's got nice specific activities that build up from that initial, like even talking about what knowing means versus not knowing and versus guessing. It's kind of talking through all that vocabulary with then activities to help build on that skill. So I suppose we can just use it quite flexibly, I'd say, and pick up as and when we need to.
Yeah.
So I think what my next plan is just to kind of go to the office, photocopy all the bits that everyone can take away, and then you're more than welcome to kind of pick up and look through the different activities and see what you think might work. Because you can buy this on the website, so there must be some expectation that they're not going to, therapists in practice, when they buy it, they're not going to be doing it exactly the same way as the researchers, because they've not been trained in using it apart from having the manual. So yeah, that was my thoughts so far. I don't know if anyone's got any questions or anything they wanted to discuss further.
I'm just astounded that they got 85 children that were just social communication disorder, because I'm like trying to rack my brain and think, have I got any that are that? But when they get referred on the social communication pathway, like through CAMS, they've all come back with an autism diagnosis. So I'm like, I don't know who
Yeah,
these.
this is it, isn't it? Like
Maybe we overdiagnose, or maybe they overdiagnose. I don't know. I'm gonna in the next week be looking at who those children could be.
yeah, because I'm thinking there's children that I have on my caseload that've got clear like social communication needs. Maybe they are social communication disorder and I've not diagnosed them, but a lot of the staff just say to me, oh, they're really autistic, or yeah, they've got autism because they've got social communication needs. And when you ask them, like, why do you think they've got autism, like what, and a lot of what they describe isn't the typical autistic traits of, like, you know, the sensory differences and the repetitive. It's all to do with, oh, well, they don't have eye contact and they don't do this, and it's all those like pragmatic social skills that the staff tend to describe. I don't know if other people have found similar or.
Yeah, and like Sophie was saying, that if they don't get diagnosed with ASD, they just get bounced back.
Yeah,
it's just like, no, they don't have it. So
and there's no other pathway for them to access then, is there? Like,
yeah.
There's not a clear social communication without autism pathway. I know that's something, Joe, that Blackpool have been looking into more and more, isn't it? Because if children don't meet the criteria for autism and for that diagnosis, it's like, what else is available for these children then? And will they just slip through the cracks and we don't get to see them? They can't access services.
Yeah, they're just trying to make it more calling it social communication difficulties and making that more of the thing, rather than having a labels going, let's just manage social communication difficulties regardless of what label you have.
Yeah, and would that include children with autism as well, or would they be on a specific autism pathway?
I'm not sure. I guess. I don't know. No, I don't know, but I think they're just looking at just having it as social communication and getting everybody to embrace that.
Yeah.
And manage that rather than labels.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think we were saying that at the beginning, like there's so many children that don't fit neatly into any of these labels. And, you know, I think if we can target the presentation and the characteristics and what we're seeing and target the need rather than the diagnosis, then it's more meaningful anyway, isn't it? And it's more targeted.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. I think there's still a lot of work, isn't there, on understanding all the different kind of overlapping features, like we said earlier, and just raising that awareness that just because a child's got social communication difficulties doesn't necessarily mean they've got autism. Like these can be two separate things, but obviously a child with autism would have as part of that kind of need social communication difficulties as well. But yeah, I think we're still like in the early phases of kind of understanding kind of social communication needs, aren't we? And I read something, I don't know if anyone had seen it, you know, the Catalyze study that they did for developmental language disorder, where they came up with the new kind of label for it rather than SLI. I don't know where I got it from, but I got a PowerPoint presentation, I think it was from NAPLIC, and it basically said that they don't recognise social communication disorder as the label that's given in the DSM-5. They still count it as DLD because pragmatic language impairment is a language issue, not a social communication issue. So it's like, so some people just not using SCD at all, and if they don't agree with it. It really confused me. I've got the PowerPoint, I think it's in the folder. I saved it because I just thought that's quite interesting.
I remember we went over that in university as well, that there was so much overlap between the two that you either use one or the other. But I guess I was a bit confused how you could get DLD and SCD, as in you can't diagnose autism and SCD together, but you can diagnose DLD and SCD together. So I guess there's just that much overlap that they're kind of interchangeable.
Yeah, because I thought like SCD, my understanding was that's when you don't have grammatical and like vocab difficulties. But if you have that with DLD, how do you know that's DLD and not part of the SCD? I don't know.
Part of the DLD is all language, including pragmatic, that comes under the DLD diagnosis.
Yeah, and that's why they were saying, well, social communication shouldn't be separate. It should still be under DLD because that covers pragmatics. But pragmatics is a language domain, but the social cognition and social understanding is wider than just language, isn't it? Which is why it's changed from PLI to SCD. But
now I think I'm going to just stick to describing the characteristics. Yeah.
I think I'm starting to get better at DLD and like saying, I never say this child has developmental, I say this child has a profile indicative of developmental language disorder. So I might start doing that. This child's profile is indicative of social communication disorder. And kind of just, yeah, tentatively putting it in there without committing to it, I suppose. But I don't know, I'm hoping like obviously if we are able to access any kind of support or training from Kathy Adams, and I know Kathy Adams is actually due to retire this month. She sent me an email saying she's retiring, but she's staying on in an honorary capacity. So I think it will be Jacqueline Gale that will lead all of like the training. Apparently they've just done a project where she's trained a group of SLTs in Austria in using the skip. So I don't know whether there's going to be a research paper coming out about that or maybe just kind of a summary paper, but it'd be quite useful to know and look at any differences, you know, in terms of like, do they target social skills in the same way? There must, you know, there must be maybe some like cultural differences that they've got to take into account. So it'd be interesting to see whether they've adapted it to use in Austria. But I don't know like where they're up to in terms of like reporting that data or.
Jacqueline Gale will be the one that probably be doing the next steps then.
Yeah,
Possibly
she emailed me a couple of weeks ago, yeah, saying that they are kind of planning. So what I might do is just, would anyone be happy if I emailed Jack and just asked what the next plans are, and you know, as a team, that we might have some interest in kind of being involved, and is everyone happy for me to do that? Okay, I will see what.
I think that can only be a good thing, because actually even if down the line they dilute it a bit and they make it more user friendly, and hopefully if they're still aware of us, then they go, oh, you guys try this, and we think we might use it slightly differently. But I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there. And obviously with Kathy and Jacqueline behind it, like it's going to be good quality stuff that they're doing. It's not,
yeah,
and it's evidence-based, which I think is
it is
massive.
And it's got the strongest level of evidence for a social communication intervention in terms of what's out there. This is like the highest standard and the highest level of evidence in terms of how it's been evaluated, the randomized control trial. So when you look at like, you know, the BCRP and that what works document, the skip is mentioned as like one of the kind of best intervention approaches that we have for social communication skills, which is why I think it is such a good resource for us to access, but we just need a more accessible way to access it. So,
well, I'm sure we could do our own adapted version anyway if needs be, with your expertise of it. If we need to do it as part of a group, you can take the activity and the core skills and I guess help us.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this, like especially the phase 2, you know, the intensive kind of block that covers social understanding, pragmatics and language processing, from what I'd read, a lot of it is one-to-one. It's very intensive one-to-one input. And I think given that model where I talked about, you know, and a lot of the research that I've read lately that says, you know, we need to really include peers and kind of raise that awareness and discover different like aspects of like the same skill that people, you know, it's not just kind of you have this skill or you don't, it's that there's this continuum. And, you know, people like with eye contact, you know, some people don't like giving a lot of eye contact. Some people can be quite intense with eye contact, and it's knowing what each person feels comfortable doing as well and what works for them. And I think that's going to work better having that discussion with peers as a group rather than just on a one-to-one. And from what I've read in here, there's not a lot of group activities. So whether that's something they can look at in the future is how do we adapt to these one-to-one and make it more group friendly as well.
Yeah, because I think the narrative around social skills has changed quite a bit since they first started in 2012. We are more about environmental changes and, like you said, celebrating diversity, doing it a two-pronged approach where, yes, we teach skills, but we also need to increase the tolerance of others and the peers around them. So it's perhaps a different approach to when they first started doing the manual.
Because I think it'll just help with that understanding of, you know, like recognizing different needs and accepting that people have different needs and that's okay, and not expecting, you know, like where children are like, oh, they do it this way, and it's like, but that's okay, and this person does it this way, and you do it a bit differently to that person as well, and everyone does things, no two people do things exactly the same way.
Yeah, there's a majority way to do things, but there's not a wrong way as such in terms of communication. People are doing what their brain is naturally telling them to do.
And even within the majority, there's such variation still. And within the neurodiverse population, there's variation still. So it's just kind of expanding on, there's a great deal of variation in one skill. And we all do it a little bit differently in different situations as well.
Well, I'm excited to use the skip, but my other side is thinking, well, Belle, you could create something amazing here. Using that model that you have come up with, you could create a therapy approach that puts all of that together in one.
I kind of feel like that would be like a massive task, given the, like what's in here, like, and exactly what there is to tap and to target. I feel like that would be like, I feel like it's a little bit of a different pathway to the, I know we've got obviously like the DRD pathway with the agents packs, but I feel like we couldn't have just one pack for social skills because it covers so many different areas. And
no, so there'd be a social communication pathway, wouldn't there, that would actually tap into some of the stuff that we've already got available.
Yeah, maybe we could have like an emotions kind of pack, or but then I think would it just be reinventing the wheel of like what we've already got from like Black Sheep Press? But I don't tend to just use Black Sheep Press. I'll use that alongside some of the zones of regulation to talk about like strengths of emotions and matching the size of the emotion to the size of the problem. So I kind of, again, I'm bringing different kind of aspects, not just, I'll use different resources alongside each other.
So I guess the pathway wouldn't be recreating things if it's already there. It'd be just putting them into an order of what you could do in that one-to-one situation, what you could do as part of a group, and how we could include peers as part of that, maybe.
I feel like there is a gap in terms of having that flow of, we've got some resources that work well in a one-to-one, some that work well in a group, but we've not got ones that kind of flow in a sequence. And then I think, Liz, did I speak to you about just developing, I was reading the study about like developing meta-pragmatic awareness, and I thought it'd be really nice for us as like maybe a team to because you know, you have some children and they can problem solve a little bit about like, oh, that's a skill that you should do in that situation, but when it comes to them actually monitoring if they do it themselves, they really struggle, even though they can recognize it maybe in a really structured situation. But it might be quite nice for us to do some videos where we role play different pragmatic skills and like a breakdown, and we get the child to identify like where it's gone wrong and look at like the other person. So obviously they do it objectively to begin with, where they're watching, maybe two of us have a conversation and one of us interrupts the other, and we'll see if they can highlight where like the breakdowns happened, but also get them to kind of start looking at other people's perspectives. Well, what was that person's body language like? How did they feel? What was the facial expression like? What could they do then to repair that situation? It's just getting all of those meta-pragmatic skills kind of flowing in awareness.
I wonder if we did like the little steering group as you suggested, and then you try out some of the activities. Actually, the reality is we probably won't do them as they are definitely out. So I totally can see, I'm like, that would be a huge amount of work to then recreate all of that, especially when like this is what they do for years and years and years. But actually it might be that, say it was that football example, it might go, well, we can use that as a kind of a bit of a stem, but actually in a group setting we've used it in this way, or we've used these questions, or we've done a follow-up session on this, and then maybe having some of those like maybe set sessions or set plans to work through that, but maybe that will only come after having tried out some of them.
And I think it is a lot of trial and error, because I think the one you're referring to, Sophie, I did that early on with, it was some children at Parkview, Liz, where they were I
remember who it was with.
really verbose, so they'd talk at length about, but a lot of it was not relevant to the situation. You'd ask them to maybe like describe a picture and they'd just go off on a tangent about something completely different, and then they'd interject with like, oh, and I went to the shop and I got some sweets and all around the houses, but they didn't actually talk about like what was relevant. So I did that task. It was all about tapping into, the child gives either too much or too little information. So I think it was Sophie with the football, it was a picture of a footballer and he's got no footballs, so he's like problem solving, what does this mean? Like, so obviously he's not going to be able to kick a ball, he's not going to be able to do his job. But then the other side was he's got 10 footballs in front of him, so it's like not enough versus too much. And it's getting the child to kind of, even those concepts of not enough and too much, I'd have like a footballer with one football, with none, and with loads, or like a postman, and I think he had one letter versus like no letters, and then like 20 sacks full of letters. And it was even saying to the children, which one is like too much, which one is not enough. And some of the children couldn't consistently identify what those concepts meant and relate them to the situations. But once they were more consistently able to do that, I then started, before I got them to monitor themselves, to try and monitor if I was going off topic or giving too much information or not enough. And I started it with really simple like routines. So I think there was one of like brushing my teeth and the sequence, and I had pictures. So I was like, oh, well, I get the toothbrush, and then I went to the shop and I just started talking randomly about something. And I was like, did I say everything? You know, did I give the right amount of information? And they were like, yeah. And it's getting them to like recognize, well, I talked about going to the shop. Is that related to brushing your teeth? No. Okay, so I don't think that's relevant, is it then? That's probably too much information. Or if they give too much detail about something. So I've got quite a few children where you ask a question and it'll be relevant to what they're talking about, but it's over specific and it's information that you don't necessarily need. So the child that's just been referred to me, she's got ADHD in year 6. And when I asked the teacher, he was like, no, she's fine and she's really bright and, you know, there's no difficulties. But I had a really long conversation with mum on the phone, and mum was like, she's really over literal, she misunderstands situations, like she can't understand sarcasm and humour, and all these different things were kind of coming to light as we unpicked what was going on. And I did the ACE assessment with her, and she scored 84th percentile for vocabulary, but what it doesn't pick up on, and these are these subtle kind of differences that as therapists we pick up on them, but it's not necessarily apparent from doing a standardised assessment that there's a problem. So, you know, the picture of the rhino, on the ACE naming. She was like, that's a white rhino and rhinos are extinct. And do you know there's only, and then I just got like a few minutes of just talking specifically about white rhinos. And I just thought that's too much information. That's not, I asked you just about rhinos and she just, so it's kind of, even though if you looked at her assessment scores, you think, oh, she's fine with vocabulary and it's not an issue. But that kind of over precise information was apparent quite a few times, so it wasn't like a one-off, and it really impacted on how she was getting a message across, because she'd just go off on this tangent, and it ties in with like topic maintenance, but she wasn't even aware that she was doing it. She wasn't picking up on my signals of, okay, that's enough now. Like, she was just kind of carrying on. So it's all those more subtle kind of language difficulties that
I think, Mariam, we've just assessed 2 in a row actually like that, didn't we? Where one was on the 99th percentile on the assessments, and I think you said, well, do we discharge them then because they're within normal limits? It's like, well, but there's clearly something else going on for them that the assessment doesn't pick up on. And they even scored in the inferencing, but they gave that much information that they did hit the right things to get a point.
Yeah.
But there was a load of garbage in between it all.
Yeah, and that's what the assessments don't pick up on, do they? And I think it's in one of the articles that I've included where it said, do not discharge a child with social communication difficulties based on the language scores, because you're missing out a big chunk of need that they have that language scores won't tap into. And I know my nephew, he's like 8, he's got his autism diagnosis now, but major social communication difficulties. And the NHS therapist was going to assess him because he was in normal limits on the RAPT. And my sister had to phone up and like argue and fight for him to stay on. She was like, he doesn't have any friends, and you know, he talks repetitively about like just one thing, and I'm really concerned about him, you know, I'm worried that he's not going to have any friends. And reluctantly they agreed to keep him on, and now he's doing like social communication activities and things. But just based on language assessment alone and language scores, it's not highlighting the needs of these children, is it, fully?
No, and that's where the identification of need that I think it was Joe's done has been really useful in the schools that we've been sending it out to.
Yeah.
Because on paper, these kids were like, oh, look what the teacher said about them. We had loads of information that it triggered the definitely needs a referral to speech therapy. And then on paper, there was nothing. So it's like, okay, we're clearly missing something.
Yeah. And the child that I'd seen, so she'd scored on the 50th centile for non-literal comprehension. So in a really structured task with picture information and those 4 choices, she could work out the meaning, like that it wasn't, you know, like the boxed in. She was like, oh, well, no one would really put boxes around a car, so it's got to mean that they're blocked in, kind of thing. And she could work out the meaning. But when it's not structured and just in everyday situations, she really misinterprets situations and what people say in that figurative language. She finds really difficult. But I know, Sophie, you've asked about this, haven't you, as well? Like, are there any assessments that we can use that tap into that skill a little bit more, and that are a bit more, they've got that real life validity of picking up the difficulties where they're there?
Yeah,
I hate the non-literal.
Because how do you know they've just not been exposed to it?
Well, yeah, and when I spoke to this child's mum, she did say, oh, but I've been teaching her things, you know, about like idioms and set phrases, and you know, that it doesn't always mean what it says. So I think like raining cats and dogs, mum had really told her about this, so she could explain to me what it meant. But then other things, I think I said like over the moon, and she was like, what, like an astronaut? So I was like, I really had to explain like that phrase and what it meant. And I think without having those conversations and that informal assessment, you could miss out on some of those things and think, oh, well, on the ACE, you know, they find the non-literal comprehension's actually okay.
I just recently started using reading between the lines again.
Yeah.
That's on the drive. I'm only at the, but more for inference, because we were finding it difficult that they were relying so much on the visual information. That was really helping them. But when you take away the visual information in a conversation, for example, they couldn't piece things together. So the reading between the lines has been quite good for that. But yeah, I hate the non-literal comprehension on the ACE, because you get the children that, you know, they either score really poorly, but also there's such a demand on reading or remembering all the information, even particularly on the written ones. And so many kids have said, oh yeah, the dogs have died, and they go, oh, poor doggy, but actually it's because they probably think that's something that I understand that vocabulary, rather than, and it's one of the first ones that comes up, and it's a bit more kind of, oh, it's a bit shocking, rather than, you know, any of the others. So I don't know if there is a more useful tool. I did use the I think, Joe, it might have been years ago, that suggested the idiom awareness task, I think, but they've got some really niche idioms on there that are just like to be in the red and to be in the black, and I don't think many of our kind of 7-8-year-olds will be understanding those sorts of terms. But I can't remember, Joe, if you suggested something else or what as well.
I just make up my I just made up my own assessment, which there's a few idioms, and then a couple of visual metaphors, and then an example of sarcasm, like just in pictorial form, with a carrier phrase. But yeah, there's nothing. One of the Kelfs, I don't know which one, had a real element of that figurative language as an assessment, but I can't remember which one it is. I thought it was in the 5, but it's not. Or is there more of a social Kelf? But they definitely had those sorts of assessments in it.
It's not the understanding spoken paragraphs, but I've not used that for a long time. But that,
no, it definitely had idioms and other figurative language in it, but I can't remember. So I just basically make up my own. But it would be good to have, maybe if as part of the group, we can put together a little informal assessment that we can use. It doesn't have to be like, we're not going to use it as standardized. We're just going to go, is this something that they struggle with?
Yeah. And
there's so many times where you get it and they go, yeah, they really struggle, and in like conversation, then you do the non-literal comprehension, and it basically says, no, they're really good at it, and you think, yeah, right, well, I'm not going to include that score because that really doesn't help my point.
And I think a lot of the examples, like in the ACE, they're quite dated, aren't they? And they're not very applicable to like real life settings for like what the children might encounter in terms of idioms and non-literal language. I don't find it very, like you said, very useful or very accurate.
Because I think because idioms are it's very changeable. It's very urban, isn't it? It's very specific and cultural, and I just think, I think you can't get too bogged down with it. You know, if they are struggling with it, they're struggling with it. We just have to help them understand that not all languages, you know, that there's figurative language out there, and to check it out. You know, sort of like, you know, ask, be a bit of an investigator if they don't understand it. There's a lot of stuff my kids say I haven't got a bloody clue what they're talking about, because it's very, you know, his language is changeable. That's what's beautiful about it. But you know, it develops over time, and I think idioms are part of that, aren't they? All this figurative language.
Yeah.
And we have to move with it as well.
Yeah, and I think it's like helping people in the child's environment. Like we said, it's more environmental now, to understand like if you use idioms and like language kind of, you know, in a non-literal kind of way, and the child's very over literal in how they interpret things, make sure that you're checking that the child understands what you mean and just kind of explain it to them. Because I know the child that scored on the 50th centile, they'd gone on a class trip, and the teacher was like, right, I'm leaving you all here now. I think they'd gone to like a factory or somewhere, and he's like, right, I'm leaving you to do some work. And he went off, and she got really upset because she thought, oh, I actually have to work now, and he's leaving me, and what am I going to do? And she was really worked up. But when I asked the teacher, he was like, no, she was fine. But when I spoke to mum, she was like, no, she was really, really upset when she came home, and she struggled to kind of move on from it. So I think it's even different people within the child's environment can interpret things so differently, can't they? So yeah, I think it's just making people aware of like different strategies to use to help that child. And
I don't think people are always aware of their own communication style. So it's definitely at EdDiv, the teachers, I don't know, it's a culture, they're just so sarcastic all the time. And I just don't think they're always aware of that and the impact it has on some of the students.
Yeah. It's just become ingrained now, where they're just used to it.
Yeah. You'll just sit there going, I have no idea.
Yeah, but it's kind of being aware, isn't it, that it doesn't come easily to some people, like understanding that sarcasm and humour, and kind of those little white lies kind of things. And I think, yeah, there's obviously a section of that in the skip, but when you kind of look back at the assessment, is there anything that actually taps into that skill? How would you know to work on that if you've not looked at it as part of the assessment? And I think
how do you, you know, what do you do? Do you look at environment? Do you look at everything? You know, it does. The skip sounds really, really interesting. It sounds quite in depth. But I liked when you were saying before about them possibly linking things from the CCC to, which would actually direct you then. So like, okay, so we can see that this is where they're struggling. Let's look at their priorities. Let's gather information from everybody to see, you know, what's having them the most impact on them in terms of their day-to-day communication, and let's work on those. Yeah.
I think we get a lot of that information from like the parent reports and the teacher reports more than anything, don't we?
Combining it all, yeah.
So yeah, what I'm planning on doing is the next child I get where I'm like, right, because I did, when I saw this child obviously with like social communication difficulties, it's just before Christmas, and I was like, right, I'm going to use this skip and I'm going to do it really systematically. And then time got away from it, and then obviously priorities for seeing other children, and I just thought I'm just going to just fall back on what I know, and I've just gone to practical pragmatics and this, because I was too scared to even like pick up the manual and know where to begin, because it just feels like it's such a time constraint, even the planning side of it, let alone getting around to doing the therapy at the minute. So what I'm planning on doing is, hopefully the next child that I have, I'm just going to set some time aside and just work on the assessment phase, and just tell myself it's okay to take a few sessions just to really plan this, because it's going to take a bit of time. I've not done it before in this kind of depth. And then I might try and do like a case study that I can present to you next time and discuss exactly what I've done, going from assessment, mapping that assessment to intervention targets, moving through the different phases to then looking at how I've recorded the outcomes at the end. So that might be a little plan, a little project that I try and set for myself. I think this is going to be more of a long-term kind of team effort that we kind of, that we all do together.
Yeah, I'm in. I've got a few already that I think would benefit from this. So.
Oh, that's good. So maybe, have you already seen them, Liz, for like assessment and things?
I've seen them for an initial, and perfect scores on assessment. Talk to the teacher. This child is in your face, saying, "Are you still my friend?" all the time, and the kids have no tolerance for him at all. I think his SPD and ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
But the biggest barrier is his social skills, which has massively impact on his social skills. Joe, it's the one that I was texting about, the one that's been suicidal.
Oh yeah.
And has been in a real low place, but he swings from being really low to being really high and giddy. But in the assessment session, he kept saying to me, like, am I funny? Am I good at this? And it was just really seeking approval all the time. Like I said, on assessment, on paper, on the assessment, he's within normal limits. So to get him seen by the other services, I've got to really deep dive into the social communication side of it.
And it sounds like there's other things, obviously, like self-esteem and.
Yeah, I think the root of it is the undiagnosed ADHD, I think.
Yeah. Oh, so maybe, Liz, that could be one that if we have time, we could look at planning together and looking at.
I'd like that. It's a Parkview child.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. So that might be quite nice to unpick together, look at the assessment data that you've got, and if you've not started any intervention, if there's more assessment using like the skip forms, on the record form.
Yeah, because all I've done is the ACE at the minute.
Okay, so yeah, maybe we could have a conversation about some other. I feel like the way to tackle the skip is just one little phase at a time, one little step, so it's not overwhelming. And I'm going to do the same with just focus on the assessment phase for now. Once I've done that and unpicked that, we'll then look at the next bit further down the line.
That sounds like a really good idea, because your young person, Liz, sounds like the ideal person to do it on, and you kind of need all of that information to share with everybody. Going, it's this. So it might be good. It might be a really good project to do with him to go, yeah, that's it.
It would be. I think
how
we
we get the information.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jo, especially because he hasn't had anything before. He hasn't had anything yet, so we haven't got anything that'll skew the data. Because I've done some things before, and I think, well, I actually don't know if that's a result of that intervention or the one that they did before it.
Yeah.
But he's had, and like I said, his scores are all within normal. Structural language is absolutely fine, so it is all social communication.
But I suppose, like, looking at I was going to say, Liz, in terms of like what children might have accessed before, when you look at like the SCIP paper, this says, you know, children who didn't get treatment, they were on the control group, just got treatment as usual. So does that mean they'd already received something before, prior to being entered into the SCIP study? I don't think you can really rule out children on the basis of having previous intervention.
Yeah.
Maybe has it already primed them for like certain things, but if the need's still there, then there's still work to be done, isn't there, and things to be targeted.
Yeah. But yeah, we'll arrange something, Belle, after
Yeah, that sounds good. And if anyone else has children where they think, yeah, I'll give it a go just doing the initial assessment to begin with, please let me know, and I'm happy to share ideas or like get together. Like I said, I'm gonna put a lot of the resources that I can in the office, so if people do want to access anything from there, obviously that's where it'll be.
Fab, thank you.
That's
Thank
fine.
you so much. That's been really interesting.
I know it feels like a lot to kind of take in, doesn't it, and a bit overwhelming, but yeah, I'll let you know. I'll have the conversation with Jack about what the next phase is and the possibility for us to be involved. I'll let you know what she says.
Yeah, good idea.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Belle.
See you soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Okay, so I think I might just close the chat down rather than messaging me, just in case you can't
Yeah,
see.
you can probably just end it, can't you?
Yeah, and I think it'll stop recording automatically, won't it?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so what we could do, Liz, then is if you do have time, we can arrange to have like maybe a little just mini meeting to discuss this child. We'll go through the SCIP.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've got my diary with me now. Have you got yours?
I do, yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, should we get something penciled in now? That'd be good.
I think on your screen is there a stop recording button. I think you should be able to.
Oh yes, there is.
I think he handed admin over to you, didn't he?